What is a spiritual director? That is a question I get asked a lot. Oftentimes, when I tell somebody that I'm a spiritual director, most of the time, when I tell somebody that I'm a spiritual director, that's the question that they ask. It's just not something that many people know about. And unless they're reaching out to me because they already know I'm a spiritual director, they usually ask that question. So if you're here watching this video because you have the same question, let me assure you, you are certainly not the first person to ask that question. Even myself, I did not know what a spiritual director was for a good portion of even my adult life. I grew up going to church almost every Sunday, had never heard what a spiritual director was. I worked in a church for almost 15 years before I ever really heard the term spiritual direction, or at least had it introduced to me in a way that piqued my curiosity enough to say, what is that? What is that? The graduate school that I went to had a certificate in spiritual direction, and that's the first time that I remember seeing that there was a program for that and not knowing what it was. So I want to take a few moments today to tell you a little bit more about what a spiritual director does, and more specifically, for your purposes, if you're watching this video, what spiritual direction is and what you might expect if you were going to do or take spiritual direction. We don't really have a good verb to use there. My name is John Chandler, and if you haven't deduced this by now, I am a spiritual director. This video is one that I'm creating to actually place on my website for spiritual direction, but you might be finding this video on YouTube as part of my channel. And so if you are finding it there and you're curious and want to learn more once you're done watching the entirety of this video, then I'd welcome you to jump down in the description and you'll find a link to my website for spiritual direction. And maybe you're watching this video on my website, and so I'd encourage you. I actually publish quite a few videos on YouTube about things not necessarily really about spiritual direction, but some adjacent interests that I hope you might find valuable as well. So you can click through and watch this video there and find some of my other videos. All right, so on to spiritual direction. What is it? One of my favorite little summaries of what spiritual direction is comes from a man named David Benner, who I have learned a great deal from merely by reading his books. And one of the things that he writes in one of his books, I believe it's one called Sacred Companions, he writes, "What exactly do spiritual directors do? The simple and most direct answer I can give is that they help others attend to God's presence and revelation and prepare to respond to Him." So the work of spiritual direction is the work of spiritual attentiveness. Now, you already might have a little bit of hang up if you're watching this video, maybe not, or maybe you have a little hang up with his phrase, "to God's presence," because you're not sure what your own faith is. I mentioned church earlier. I mentioned I was a pastor earlier. And so maybe you've tuned out by now. Thanks for still watching if that's true for you. And what I'd like to say is, yes, I do offer spiritual direction. I do come with a mindset that matches up with the Christian faith and the spiritual direction that I offer. But that doesn't mean that that has to be the place that you are coming from, because the idea of spiritual direction is setting aside time to stop and be spiritually attentive, to try to understand what kind of sacred presence might be speaking into your life. Now, of course, if you do come from a faith background, and particularly if you share with me a Christian faith background, then there might be some more common language that you and I will use in spiritual direction. But I'm also happy to meet with people who don't have a defined understanding of their own religion or of their own faith, but are just spiritually curious. So the work then is to sit down and merely listen together. Every time I meet with somebody for spiritual direction, we start out with a time of silence. And that silence begins with me welcoming that silence through a prayer. And if you come from a Christian background, every time I will begin with the same prayer: "Blessed Trinity, we receive your welcome." And if you are uncomfortable with some of the Christian language, I just simply begin with "Sacred Presence, we receive your welcome." And then we sit in silence to be attentive, to allow our own awareness to be present to what that sacred presence might be doing in our time together. And sometimes that silence will last 20 seconds. Sometimes that silence will last 20 minutes, sometimes perhaps even longer, because how long that silence lasts is up to the person that I'm meeting with that day. And in that silence, you might just be trying to be present yourself. You might be reflecting on what it is that you have in mind that you would like to explore and talk about that day. It might be that you have something in mind, but as we are speaking, somehow that sacred presence says to you, no, spend time wrestling with this issue or with this moment from your life that you recently had. And it might be that you come away from that silence, however long you choose to have that silence go on, just with nothing in your mind. And then I can begin to ask you questions and explore with you. So my role as a sacred director, my role as a spiritual director is merely to journey alongside you. I sit with you and I ask questions because our hope is to understand what is it that God, what is it that this spiritual sacred power is speaking into your life, and how will you respond to it? Ultimately, the goal is not just to hear that sacred voice in our time together, but to begin to learn how to be aware of what God might be saying to you throughout the rest of the time, throughout the rest of your days, throughout the rest of your moments. And so sometimes that means we might do different kinds of listening or prayerful practices together. Sometimes that really is just conversation and me asking questions, and sometimes that's just a matter of being able to sit in silence together. Typically in spiritual direction, I meet with somebody once a month, although sometimes we adjust those schedules as well. I do it primarily via Zoom. I am in the Phoenix area, so sometimes I meet with people in person here, but most of the time I meet with someone over Zoom and find that that actually works surprisingly well. I will say that spiritual direction is a broad umbrella, and it's practiced across many different expressions of the Christian faith, and it's even practiced among other religions as well. So the spiritual direction that I'm describing to you today is how I approach it, mostly from my own Christian background, and mostly through the training I've received, and just based on my own experience of how I feel like it works best when I meet with someone. If you would be interested in learning more, I would be happy to meet with you. Through my website, you can sign up for a free 30-minute consultation to get a little bit more acquainted. And if it feels like you and I would work together well, I'd be glad to work with you. Or if, as we talk, we just feel like we don't quite have the rapport that you were hoping for, I would also be glad to perhaps give you other options you might want to explore for spiritual direction. I'm just thankful you're here, thankful you're listening along. If you're watching on YouTube, I would love to hear about your own experiences of spiritual direction in the comments below, or if you want to leave any questions there, you can leave those as well. Thanks so much for watching. I'd appreciate it if you would like this video, if you find it helpful. And of course, I would love to have you subscribe to my channel, where I talk about a lot of other topics that are somewhat adjacent to this. The idea of practical wisdom for mindful living is kind of the theme of my channel.